This is the Life and Times of Louise Klein, video 2. You were telling a story about Annie.
Oh, yeah. Annie came to the United States and came to our house.
Well, let's start back. So who's Annie again, just in case somebody comes back
Auntie
into
Anne
this?
is my father's sister, the youngest. There was something with a bad engagement, and she came to New York. I didn't know anything about this. I was a kid. I might have been 6 years old. At any rate, she came and she gave me this diamond ring, a little ring with a diamond in it, and I loved it. It was mine, and I would wear it every place. Then one of these Saturdays or Sundays, I was at my Aunt Rose's house, and I took off my ring to wash my hands, and I left my ring there. Now this is a house full of my relatives. No strangers, just relatives. And I realize I don't have it, so I go back to the faucet, and it's not there. So I go to my mother and I say, my ring isn't here. What do you want to do? I didn't know what to do. And she said to me, forget about it. And I forgot about it because I'm a good kid. But for years, she said, forget about it. What did that mean? Did she take the ring? Or does she know that somebody who needed the money took the ring? But somebody in the house took the ring. And I never found out who. So that's my story about the engagement ring.
Was Annie your only aunt from your father's?
Yeah. My father's side.
From your father's side.
He had two brothers, Izzy and Sam.
Okay, so what about Izzy and Sam? Do they have, where did they live? Children? What's their stories?
I would just like to add something. My grandparents came from the Ukraine. I have the name of the city, but I always forget it. Wurzburg or something like that. And their parents, my grandmother's parents, her mother's name was...
This is Pauline's parents?
What?
This is Pauline's parents.
No, this is my father. We're on my father's side now.
Oh, well, let's finish your mother's side.
We are finished with my mother's side.
So Annie was your only aunt from your father's side?
Yes. My grandparents were named Esther and Jacob, and they had 3 children. They were Uncle Sam, Joseph, Izzy was the baby, and Auntie Anne. There were 4 children. My father was born in Russia. The rest of them, I believe, were born in Canada.
So your father was the oldest?
Yes, Sam was the oldest. He was born in Russia. And so was my father. My father says he was born in Russia, but the birth certificate that you saw says he's born in Canada. So somebody's lying. Again, this business about what's convenient they put down. So my father was born in Russia. They came here.
Wait, but I thought your... maybe I'm confusing myself. The French connection, that was your mother's father and your mother's mother.
Right.
So this is your father's mother and your father's father.
Right. Now, they came from the Ukraine.
Both of them?
As far as I know. There's a whole bunch of stories, but we don't know what's true.
So what are some of the stories?
Firstly, I wanted to say that my great-grandmother is Hannah.
Great-grandmother on what side?
We're talking about my father.
Okay.
This is my father's family. I've forgotten my great-grandfather's name. I have it.
But your great-grandmother,
Is
her name
Hannah.
is Hannah, but your great-grandmother on your grandmother's side or your grandfather's side?
Oh, we're talking about my grandmother's side. There is nothing, I have no history about my grandfather's side. He seems to have been something of a black sheep someplace. My brother has a story about him, and I've never heard it, but my grandmother had a large family, and many of them came to the States. They settled in Canada and in Philadelphia, and there are still some in Russia.
In Ukraine.
I don't know if they're in the Ukraine, but yes. What happened was a woman contacted me, Hannah. Hannah contacted me from Canada. She lives in London, Ontario. She says, I'm your cousin, and this is my father's family. Now, I had nothing to do with anybody in my father's family. When we went to Philadelphia, my father used to disappear for a couple of hours. And we were the kind of kids who would say, take us with us, take us, take us. And he never took us with it, took us. But he was going, took us. We were going to, he was going to his favorite cousin. And he never took us. And so we never met that side of the family, although there's a large contingent in Philadelphia. And this girl, this woman that contacted me, originally lived in Philadelphia and knew all these people. Now she lives up in Canada, in Ontario, London, Ontario, and she lives there with her husband and 2 children. So this woman is marvelous. This woman, she made the history of every one of the children. It's a very large family. There's maybe 7 or 8 children, of which my grandmother was one. And it's interesting, her maiden name was Lechenmacher, which means cake maker. And my grandmother was a marvelous baker. She used to bake Danish and cookies and make cheese. My grandfather had a cow. He would milk the cow. My grandmother would make cheese, and it would drip in the store. The cheeses would drip in the store, and she'd sell the very good coffee cake.
This is your grandmother?
This is my grandmother Esther.
So you knew your grandmother Esther? I don't think I've ever heard you say a word about anybody but Pauline.
Okay, well there's a reason for it. Now, I've been in contact with them several times. The first time I was about 7 or 8 months old. It seems my father had a hernia operation, and for some reason or other he went to Canada to recuperate. My opinion is he never came back. I don't think that he wanted to live with my mother. So my mother got on a train with me and went to Canada to pull him to come back. This is my interpretation, because it's very strange that he went to Canada and didn't come back. I feel that she went back there and got him.
How old were you?
I was about 6 months old. I wasn't walking. I have pictures of myself being held by my father in Canada. And she convinced him to come back. He came back, and that's the first time I saw my grandparents. The second time I saw my grandparents...
So your grandparents lived where?
In Glace Bay, Nova Scotia.
Okay.
They had a grocery store, and upstairs they had bedrooms.
So they moved from Ukraine to Nova Scotia.
Yes, a lot of Jews went there because the Russian workers The miners in the Ukraine went there to work. They had the gold mines and the coal mines. So my grandparents went there. They opened this store, and they had the rest of the children there. And there were bedrooms upstairs, and there was a living room downstairs, and a kitchen. And I was 8 years old. My brother was younger. We went and visited them. At that time, I remember my grandmother saying she was 64 years old. She's a little older than my grandfather. So we spent a week there. We went there by car. My father had a 1929 Ford, something like that. And there weren't the tar roads. It was all dirt roads. It was quite an experience. And sometimes we had to take a ferry.
Right, you took the ferry from Maine probably across.
No, I don't think, I think we did that, when Teddy and I went there, we did that. But I don't think we did that when we went. We went this way. With Teddy, we went this way. So that was the second time I saw them. And we were kids, we were young kids. And I wasn't too impressed with my grandfather. He had a sulky and a horse, a trotter. You know,
What's a sulky?
A sulky is a type of carriage that you use for a horse, especially a racing horse. You know, the horse. It's very impressive. It's beautiful. And my grandfather brought it out. I went around this beach, because this town is right on the ocean, and we were at the beach, and he's going back and forth with the horse and the carriage. He didn't stop that horse and carriage and say, "Come on, I'll give you a ride." Had two young grandchildren there. Give him a ride, you know, give him a thrill. No, he's got to show off. I was not impressed with my grandfather. So that was the second time we saw them. The third time, I was working.
Did they have kids in the house at this point? Because you said it was your father was the second oldest.
No, they were all out of the house. Nobody.
So you were now just visiting your grandparents.
At that time, yes, but Izzy was supposed to be there. Izzy still lived there, but he was in college, and he was away at college at the time, so we didn't see him. We went, when we were going home, my father stopped at the college to see if we could see him, but we couldn't find him. He was an outstanding sportsman. He's an ice skater, ice hockey, and that's something else. Anyway, so that was the second time we went.
But their last name, they were Druckers, all of them.
No, they're Hyiskis.
They are Hyiskis, but these are from your father's side. So your father was a Hyiski?
No, my father was born a Hyiski. When he came, that's another story. I'll tell you in a second. How my father came to this.
I'm glad I'm keeping up at least.
Yeah, well, that was the second time. The third time, I was 18. I graduated from high school, and I was working in the Federal Reserve Bank, coin and bullion. I used to take the deposits of the coins coming in from the subways. So I had a vacation. So I decided I was going to spend a week with my grandmother. So I flew for the first time by myself to Nova Scotia.
Is it the first time you ever flew?
Yes. I flew to Nova Scotia. I had to take 3 different planes. The first plane was to Boston.
Talk a little louder so you can hear.
Oh. I had to take 3 planes. The first one was from New York to Boston. The second one was from Boston to Halifax. And then from Halifax I took a local. So the local went from here to here to here to here to here until we got to Sydney, Nova Scotia. So I saw my grandmother, and I met my Uncle Izzy and his girlfriend Viola. He lived with Viola for 40 years until he died, but he never married her. He had 3 sons with him, and they're beautiful men. I met 2 of them, and they're such nice men. I love them. They're so warm and friendly. Anyway.
Where did they live?
They live in, 2 live in Glace Bay and 1 lives in Halifax. He is a hair designer for one of these programs, one of these hour-long programs. They do a lot of that work in Canada. So he does that, and that was the 3rd time I saw them. And then when Teddy and I took a trip up there. We took a trip. That's when we took the ferry overnight. We slept on the ferry.
But your grandmother was the only one alive at that point? Is that what happened?
No, my grandmother was not alive anymore.
No, you told me the second time you went up to visit your grandmother.
The second time I was there, I visited my grandmother.
You were about 18, but your grandfather was not alive at that point.
Right. I visited my grandmother. She was ill. She was in bed. She was bedridden. Sometime between that time and the next time she died. Because when Teddy and I went, I had written a letter to my uncle asking if it was all right to come and visit. And I got a letter back from his wife that he died the week before. So we decided to go anyway. So we went up and we visited with Viola, his wife, and 2 of his sons. We never met the 3rd son, whose name is Joseph.
So you only met your grandfather twice?
Yeah, once when I was a baby and didn't know him, and once when I was a little kid.
And you met your grandmother only 3 times?
No, my grandmother came to the States a couple of times. In fact, one time when she was here, her husband died. And so my father took my grandmother and traveled up to Canada with her. She didn't make the funeral.
Did you have much of a relationship at all in terms of closeness with your grandmother or grandfather?
Well, with my grandmother, I was, because my grandmother came to visit us several times. She came to visit Auntie Ann, but she'd stop off to see us.
Oh, she came to visit her daughter?
Yes.
In
Because
Philadelphia?
that's where she used to spend her time, with her daughter in Philadelphia. But she would stop off and see us. I have pictures of her in Putnam Lake. She came to see us. I resemble her. I resemble that side of the family. So does Martin. Thank goodness.
As compared to which side?
And compared to my mother's side, they have terrible buck teeth and big noses.
Oh, all right.
So so Teddy and I went up there and we visited them. And that was...
And you met their children only, 2 of their children only. You never met the 3rd. So these would have been your uncles.
No, these are my cousins. Uncle Izzy is my uncle, and these are his children. So,
Right, but it was Uncle Izzy, and there was Auntie Ann, and there was one other uncle.
yeah, Uncle Sam. He was married to a woman in Newton, New Jersey, and they never had any children. He's the only one that was really Orthodox. My father used to go to visit him on Saturday, and we'd get there, and his wife would say, Izzy isn't here, Uncle Sam isn't here, he's in shul. I think my father used to do it purposely.
But did you really have anything to do with Any of these are your uncles and your aunts. Did you see them often?
No. Once we spent Christmas week with my Auntie Anne. She took care of us while my mother worked. And other than that...
So Uncle Izzy and the one in Uncle Mo, and there was one other uncle, right?
Eli? No, you're talking about
your father's
my
brothers and sisters.
That's Sam, Izzy, Joseph, and Annie.
Sam, Izzy, and Joseph. So you really didn't have anything to do with Sam, Izzy, and...
Very little. I mean, I stayed with Izzy for a week, and they were very kind to me. They were nice. And but that's all.
Why do you think that was?
Why? What do you think? What?
Well, it doesn't sound like your father made a lot of effort to incorporate you into his family.
You're right. Because whenever we said, take us with us, he never did. He never took us.
Why do you think? Any
I don't
ideas?
know. I don't know. We were kids. You know, when you're 6 years old, 8 years old, you don't know. He said no.
So he might not have had a good relationship with his own family.
Very possible. He did some nice things for us, but he wasn't there.
Your father?
My father wasn't there. My father went to work. He came home in the middle of the night. Whenever the only thing I remember is him sleeping in the bed.
So you never had much of a relationship with him?
No, not at all.
How old were you when he died?
About 21.
And even in that whole 21 years, you really had no relationship with him. Why do you think that was?
I don't know. He just, I don't think he was happy in his marriage to begin with. They used to have terrible fights. Terrible fights. My mother was not an easy person to get along with. She was a very bitter person. And it's just the way she was. I mean, with my parents, there's good points. My father was a marvelous swimmer, and I learned to swim from him. He was an ice skater. I learned to ice skate from him, you know. But my mother played the piano, so my brother and I sang songs. I played duets with my mother, and then when I had the cello, I played the cello, she played the piano. These were the high points in my life. These were the things that were good. Unfortunately, there were too many bad things. The worst thing with my mother was 6:10 p.m. That was the time my mother came home from work. And I shivered. I was so afraid of how she was going to walk in the house. It was frightening. She never picked, I asked Martin, she never picked on Martin, but she picked on me. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why'd you let it cook so long? Why didn't you cook it longer? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? I remember one time on a Saturday afternoon, she asked me to dust. So I dusted the house. She said, that's terrible. And she grabbed the rag from me and dusted over again. You know, there was no, she wasn't nice to me. And because of that, I realize now that it was very important for me to go to school because I created a relationship with my teachers. My teachers were my mothers. I felt better towards my teacher than towards my mother. And one year, I must have had some sort of way of pulling it off that I became the teacher's pet. I don't know how. I'm sure it was subconscious.
Talk a little louder.
I'm sure it was subconscious that I had to have this attention from the teacher. But those years when I had the attention of the teachers, I was the third smartest kid in the class. When it got to the point, then one year I pulled something that was going to make me the teacher's pet. She says, "Oh no, not this year." As if the teacher before told her that I was a needy kid, and she knew that I was going to do this. That year I didn't do too good in school. But I realized now that as long as I had teachers that were willing to take me under their wing, I did well. And even in junior high school, I had a science teacher, a man, who was so nice to me. He helped me. And I thrived as long as I had good teachers. When I got into high school, I got lost. I had, it's a departmental and they don't know you and this and that. Then, from then on, I went from an A student to a C student. And I didn't do well in high school, which is a shame because in those years the soldiers were coming back from the war, and they were going to college, and you couldn't get into college unless you had, I think it was an 85 at the time. And of course I was doing C work, so I was down in the 70s. So I never would have gotten to college. But I didn't try for college because I didn't know how to go to college. I thought that it was like high school. They tell you what high school to go to. They tell you what junior high school to go to, what class you're in. Here, all of a sudden I'm supposed to go to college, and no college calls me. And so a woman came to the high school, and she's talking about they have a class for dental assistant. So I figured out, I'm not going to college, I don't know how to get there, I didn't know what to do. So I decided to take a dental assistant course, which I did. And then I became a dental assistant for a year. And then I quit, and I was working 50 hours a week, and I was making $26 a week. So I figured there's enough is enough. He's making his millions, and I applied to the Federal Reserve Bank. And it's interesting, I was sitting there waiting for an interview, and there was another girl there, and it turned out this girl, Jean Greenberg, is applying for a job too. She went to Taft High School. So she went first. She came out, she said, they're not hiring right now. I went in with the name Louise Gaskin, took the test, and got a job. So they must have been hiring non-Jews, because there were very few Jews in the place. But I had years of experience in the Gentile community in Putnam Lake, because there were no Jews there were very few. So I mixed in very well, and I worked there until I got pregnant, and then I got married to Lonnie, and I quit the job, and that's the
Well, let's take a couple of steps back.
Okay.
Before we get too far into that, because I don't want to move forward until we finish everything in the back. Where did you go to school?
Oh, that's another thing. First we lived in the East Bronx, so I went.
What street? Do you remember?
Wilkins Avenue, 1476 Wilkins Avenue, and it's at the top of an incline. And my joy in life was to get in my roller skates and go down that hill, cross the street, and go down the next block, and end up in the Jennings Street Market. And I loved that. I knew every one of the squares, and I knew how it sounded, and I loved it. And it was a wonderful place to live because everybody had kids, and they didn't want the kids in the house. All the kids were outside. And in those days, in the spring, that's marbles. Everybody had marbles, immies, and we used to play against the curb. And then somebody got ingenious and got a wooden breakstone cheese box, and they put little holes in it, and you had to hit the marble into the hole, and then they give you what was in the box. They had all these different games, and we used to play outside. Never went in. When it's time for supper, all the mothers used to yell, "Louise, come up!" But and it was wonderful. I remember the skating, and then we had Crotona Park 2 blocks away, which was wonderful. They had a lake there, and they had ice skating. That's where I got my first pair of ice skates. And my father, being Canadian, taught us to skate. And that was exciting. They had boat rides, but of course we didn't have money to rent out a boat. That was for the 16-year-olds who wanted their girlfriends in the boat.
How old were you during this time?
I was 5 years old when I moved there, and we were 8 years old when we moved. Then,
where were you before, from 1 to 5?
Oh, we moved every 6 months. What happened was, my mother used to tell the story that they used to rent an apartment. When you rented the apartment, you got 1 month free, and 2 months, if you didn't pay, you had to leave after the 2nd month. So my mother we would live in an apartment for free, but then the 2 months, and then we'd have to move. It was cheaper to move than to pay the rent. So I remember moving 3 times before I was 5 years old. We moved to 3 different places.
So that must have been hard in and of itself.
Not for me, no. I was just a kid. I was worried when I was going to get the part of the chicken I liked.
So then you settled in on Wilkins Avenue.
Yeah, we lived on Wilkins Avenue for 3 years, and then...
Did you have friends there that you remember?
Oh, yeah. Downstairs on the ground floor, there was a woman named Mrs. Birdie. And she had a daughter. Her daughter's name is Fanny Birdie. Mrs. Birdie used to make parties. And when she made the party, you had to bring a nickel or 2 cents, whatever she made the price. So you had to pay 2 cents to go to one of her parties. And you didn't buy a present for Fanny if she had a birthday, you brought a nickel. So Mrs. Birdie used to make these parties. There was another thing that was going on. My mother always put us to sleep very early. We would go and we were good kids. Maud and I were good kids. So 7 o'clock she used to put us to sleep. Sometime around 8:30, 9 o'clock, I don't know why, but I would wake up. This happened more than once. Not as a general rule, but it kept on happening. It happened. I would wake up and the house is empty. Martin's asleep. I'm laying there. Nobody's in the house. And we lived on the top floor, a 5-story building. It's a walk-up, no elevator. We paid $26 a month rent. And my mother's not there.
And your father was working.
And my father was working. So I put on my bathrobe, and I went and I rang bells. There were two people in the building that I knew, Mrs. Shreebank and Mrs. Birdie. So I go to Mrs. Shreebank, ring the bell. Is my mother here? No. I go down to Mrs. Birdie. Is my mother here? No. My mother went to the movies and left us alone in the house. And she did this more than once because every time I did this, they got more and more annoyed with me that I rang the bells. So I know that I did it more than once or twice. My mother used to leave us alone in the apartment and go to the movies.
Who do you think she was going with?
Nobody. Then she went across the street to the Lowe's Boston and saw the double feature for quarter. Maybe she even got dishes. Maybe it was dish night. And she came home whenever she came home. But my mother left us alone. And that was one of the things that she did.
So that was like 5 to 8 years old. Did you have any other kids that you remember were your friends?
Oh, I was friends with Fanny Birdie, and we started out in the same class, in the 1 class, which is the smart class, you know. And then in the 2nd grade, she went into the 2 class, and I stayed in the 1 class. And Mrs. Birdie was very upset. But I was smart. I was smarter because my mother would work with me. My mother would do the spelling and the math. You know, she made sure that I...
So she was spending some time with you.
Yeah, she was. Yeah, she wasn't working. That was the difference. She didn't work.
Okay, so when did she start working? So when you were very young, only your father was working, driving the taxi.
Yeah, well, I don't think he started out as a taxi driver. He was doing other work. Then again, when we moved to Freeman Street, my grandmother moved in with us.
So you went from living on Wilkins Avenue to Fremont Street, also in the
Freeman
Bronx.
Street.
Freeman. What was the address? Do you remember?
809 Freeman Street.
Do you remember the phone number?
I don't think we had a phone yet. No, we didn't get a phone until we lived on College Avenue.
Okay, so you're on Freeman Street now.
Right.
You're maybe 8 years old.
8, 10. No, I must have been older, because while I was there, I started junior high school. So I went at 10 years old. I'm in 5, 10, 11. I was about 11 years old.
So you lived on Wilkins Avenue, you think, till you were 10?
I lived there for 5, 6, 7, 8. When I was 9 years old, we moved to
Freeman.
9, 10, 11. Then I went to junior high school, which was around the corner. That's the infamous PS 40.
So where were you going before then?
I went to PS 63. See, and then I went to 40. Now, why I call it infamous is I went to 40 and Teddy was in the following year. He was a year behind me, but he was in the school at the time.
That's funny.
Yeah. So I went to 40, and then from there, we moved to College Avenue.
How long? So when you said your grandmother moved in when you were in Freeman Street?
Yeah, on Freeman Street, my grandmother, there was an extra bedroom. There were 3 bedrooms.
So you lived with Marty in one?
Yeah, Marty and I, and my mother and father and Grandma and Sam.
And Grandma and Sam moved in because Grandma was now divorced?
Right.
And Sam was a young kid?
Yeah. So I went to junior high school there for 2 years, and then we moved. And then we moved to College Avenue. This is the West Bronx. It wasn't really, the West Bronx is further up, but they considered it the West Bronx. And
that's a step up?
It was supposed to be a step up. Well, my grandmother moved out, so we needed 2 bedrooms.
What was the address on College Avenue?
1302 College Avenue. And
So your grandmother moved out when you moved to College Avenue?
no, my grandmother moved out, and then we moved to College Avenue.
So your grandmother only lived with you for how many years?
3 years. And then, so we moved to College Avenue. Now, you have to remember my name was Gaskin. And later on in life I found out that the only people named Gaskin were black. And we lived on let's say the east side of the street. On the west side of across the street, there were kids. There weren't kids on my side of the street. And all these kids went to Wade Junior High School, and I went to a school down on Washington Avenue in the slums. In the black area with the poor people. It was 14 blocks to walk, and an 8-story flight of steps that I had to walk. It was nothing. I used to go home for lunch. Up the steps, down the steps, didn't matter. Good, healthy kid. But I used to complain to my mother that I had no friends, because they all lived across the street and went to Wade, and I went to this junior high school down on Washington Avenue.
What junior high school was it, do you know?
I've forgotten.
Doesn't matter.
No, I've forgotten. But I went down there. I mean, I was in the Rapids, so I was in a safe class. I was in a good class, but I had no friends when I came home. So in those years, I used to stay in school after school, and I'd play handball with the boys. That was good. So I play handball with the boys, and then I graduated to junior high school, and I went to high school, which was Taft, which was right there. So then I began to have friends.
It sounds like during junior high school, which is an important time, you really didn't have any friends where you were living.
Well, I had friends in school, but they lived down there, and I lived up here.
Right.
And the people that lived up here were going there.
Do you think moving around like all of this affected you?
No, I don't think so, because to this day I'm like that.
Well, I don't know. When we moved around a lot as kids, I think it affected me, because you don't get stability in terms of kids you grew up with by constantly moving. So maybe that affected you somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, could have. Yeah, I didn't have friends when I went to junior high school. When I lived on Freeman Street, I belonged to a gang. I belonged to, there were 3 girls and 5 boys. And we all met in this corner. And the old lady would yell, "Go away from the window," you know. But we hung out on that corner for a couple of years. It was fun. It was fun. Now, I never contacted these people after I moved, which is another strange thing about me. People say, "Oh, I know her since I was in public school." I don't have anybody like that.
That's what I was saying, is that you don't, you never got to develop deep, long-term relationships.
I never needed it. I never wanted it. Even to this day, I'm the same way.
It could be a defense mechanism. It's not that you didn't want it, it's just that you built up tools to avoid it, to deal with it. Possibility, especially considering other things that were going on in your life.
Yeah, but I never really needed it. I have a very good relationship with Teddy. I mean, I bitch a lot, but besides that, it's a very interesting life with him, because we talk about important things. would talk about politics and life. But a lot of people are married, they don't talk like that. I have an interesting conversation with my husband, you know. I have a very good relationship with him. We sit and talk Shabbos night. It's wonderful.
Can I go way back with a question?
Sure.
Your grandfather on your father's side was the Hayinsky family.
Hayinsky.
Hayinsky. Your grandmother on your father's side, what was her last name?
Lechenmacher.
Lechenmacher, right.
Oh, I didn't tell you how my father came to this country.
Well, did the mother Lechenmeyer have any brothers or sisters?
She had a tremendous family. I told you she had eight brothers and 5 sisters up there.
But you don't have any connection with any of them?
Never, no. I have all their life stories. I have them. In fact, I gave all my children copies of it.
She contacted me one time too.
Oh, she did?
That's
Anna?
a matter of fact. Yes, I believe she contacted me. So you never had anything to do at all with that side of it. Now, didn't that seem strange, given the size of the family, that your father...
But they all lived in Philadelphia or in Canada. They didn't live in the Bronx.
So it's not just the Hayiskis who lived in Canada, it was also the Lechenmachers.
Lechenmacher was, yeah.
The Lechenmachers also lived in Canada.
Yes.
And Philadelphia.
Yes.
Interesting that both sides of your father's side were Canadian or Philadelphia.
Well, yeah.
Did they speak French?
I don't know. I didn't talk to them.
So,
let me talk to you about my father.
Yeah, let's hear.
My father was not happy at home. My grandfather had a heavy hand. He was a hitter. And he also had a crazy horse, a cow. The cow bit off part of my father's finger. That's what kind of crazy cow he was. Anyway, my father was not happy at home. It was an Orthodox atmosphere, and he was not from the Orthodox. He ran, as I said, with the Shkutzim.
So the Hayiskis were Orthodox?
Yes.
Except it sounds like only one of the sons remained Orthodox, the one who lived in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Who you visited once. So
No. I visited him. We visited them more than once.
Okay, but so it sounds like, so he grew up Orthodox, but Annie and the other 2 brothers rejected it, and only the one...
I don't know about Annie. I don't know what she did.
Okay.
I really don't. I know that Izzy lived with Viola for 40 years and never got married. And I'm sure that they didn't live a kosher life because she's not Jewish.
Ah.
And I only know that Sam used to come home from shul.
Right. All right, so you were saying about...
He would, Martin, yeah. Joseph, my father, was not happy at home. He was not a scholar. He didn't go to school. The rest of them went to college. He quit school somewhere along the line, and he decided to come to the United States. So he bought one of these expensive racers, a bicycle, and he got as far as Boston. That's it. It's 1,800 miles or 1,300 miles. It's a long trip. He got as far as Boston, and he got hit by a car, and it destroyed the bike. And the police were called. And when the police were called, he had no money on him. He had no identification. They put him on the train and sent him back to Glace Bay. They sent him back. So then he saved up again, and he bought another bike. This time, he got that birth certificate that I showed you on that green thing, saying when he was born and who his parents are, and that his father is a reputable merchant in the city. So this time he didn't get hit by anything, and he made it to New York. as Joseph Hayisky. When he got to New York, he had one of his father's brothers lived in New York. His name is Benjamin Gaskin. He changed his name from Hayisky to Gaskin. We don't know why. We think that Hayisky has a G in it, Giskin, Giske, you know. He might have said something like that, so they put down Gaskin. He lives here. He married a nice fancy woman, and they had 3 beautiful sons.
This is your great uncle.
My great uncle, Uncle Ben, and Aunt Ida. My father went to live with them, and he changed his name to Gaskin, like his uncle. That's how he got the name Gaskin. At one point, my grandmother, Pauline, she wanted Uncle Louis, that's her son, to have a little education beside one. So she signed up for Big Brothers. This is an association that helps children. And my father came to the house as the big brother. And that's how my mother ended up marrying my father.
So your father was the big brother to Louis.
Yes.
And he met your mother because he came to the house and was being the big brother to Louis.
Right.
Just out of curiosity, why did your father had died already at this? Oh, wait. Oh, this is for Louis.
For Louis, he was a boy.
Right, so Pauline had already been divorced?
No. This is...
So he was becoming in as a big brother even though his
father
was still in the
home.
house.
The father was in the home, yeah.
So your mother met your father through the Big Brothers program when your father came in.
Right, yeah. So that's how that happened. And now, where are we?
Well, we have 8 minutes of tape left. Maybe tell me about Pauline. You said Pauline was divorced and remarried. Do you want to talk about that, her relationship with your grandfather? And
well, I can't talk about their relationship because by the time I was old enough to know much of anything, they had been divorced.
Right, so Pauline and that was Nathan were divorced.
Right.
Right, and then so Pauline moved in with you. Now Pauline then got remarried?
Yeah, Pauline met Harry at one of the dances that our family's a big, they're dancers. They used to have friendship clubs, and my grandmother belonged to all these dancing clubs. And Harry was, that's how we made a living.
But she said she was already in her 50s, right, when she got remarried?
Yes, I'm sure.
How long was she divorced originally, do you know? When did she get divorced?
I believe my grandmother was somewhere in her early 40s.
Why do you think she got divorced? Did you ever hear stories in the family?
Because I remember something about a 40th birthday when I was a little kid. I don't remember anything else, but I do remember something about her 40th birthday.
But you said she got married very young, you were
Yeah,
saying?
she was 16 or 14, I've forgotten. They had to marry her off, they couldn't feed her. And she's a beautiful woman, beautiful. And she was tall. She was like 5'7", 5'8". She carried herself very well. And she had beautiful skin.
But she had 5 children and you think she was overwhelmed?
No, I don't think she was overwhelmed as much as she was miserable with him. She didn't want to be with him. You know, she was forced into a marriage and she didn't want to be with him. And he was nice. Okay, right, he didn't...
He had a bump on his head and he was fat.
No, he wasn't fat.
Oh, he wasn't? But he's the one with the bump on his head?
He had this bump on his head. And the reason I mention it is because one day my mother was coming home from work and she hears this horrible screaming. Oh, somebody's screaming with such pain. They were cutting this bump off my grandfather's head. And she heard it all the way down the block. And then he was blind in one eye. And when my mother went to work, she worked at the Lighthouse. It's an association for blind people. She got it so that he got a glass eye. So one time Jesse and I, he had an operation. Jesse and I went to see him and was saying, and he was sleeping, but one eye was open, sort of open. And Jesse said, "Which eye is the glass eye?" And we were afraid to ask him. And we're standing there trying to figure out which is the glass eye.
That's funny. So he wasn't, so maybe from Pauline's perspective, he wasn't a great catch.
No, he was very cheap. They were all cheap. They didn't have money, you know. And I'm sure that he didn't work all the time because he worked for the West Point. I could still see.
I thought he was a musician.
That's her second husband.
So what did her first? What did Nathan do for a living?
He was a French tailor.
Oh, he was the tailor. Right. Okay. There's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah. Oh,
a big family.
I could still envision the beautiful stitches